Now, I'm going to end this poll and welcome you all tonight to the third episode of the Ketamine series. My name is Sergio Perez. I'm the director of the Mind Academy and one of the anesthesiologists at the first OVID Clinic in Berlin, Friedrichshain. This series focuses on the very diverse fields on which ketamine seems to show potential. And I'm very excited to be here because I share the same background as ketamine. We both come from the anesthesiological field and just recently find out our interest and maybe potential in psychotherapy. We're here tonight with Steve Levine, a certified psychiatrist who founded the Actify, has a great experience with treatment-resistant depression with over 6,000 patients, providing more than 60,000 infusions in 10 different locations in the US since 2011. Now he has moved forward and he's the co-founder and a chairman of Heading Health, right? Yeah, and he will be talking tonight about, Steve, what are you going to talk about tonight?
I'll be speaking about ketamine for psychiatric indications from the lab to the clinic.
All right. Let's jump into it.
Terrific. Thank you, Sergio. Appreciate the warm introduction, and thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to take part in this lecture series. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. Yes, and there's my title, Ketamine for Psychiatric Indications from the Lab to the Clinic. First of all, I'm unfortunately delivering this virtually, not live in Berlin. I wish I were there. But I should tell you that I did study German for 4 years in high school, but that was a long time ago, and sadly, I've forgotten almost all of it. The only things I remember are a couple of poems that I was forced to remember. One was a love poem by Heinrich Heine called Du bist wie eine Blume, and the other is the tower scene from Faust. But I will not embarrass myself or anyone else on this call today by attempting to speak German. I will deliver this in English. I know we've got from that poll an audience coming from many countries, so hopefully English works for everyone, and I appreciate you tolerating it from me. So without further ado, what I hope to cover today essentially is an overview, and it's a story told along a timeline starting back in 2010. Basically, the things I want to emphasize here are, number one, something that you all know, is that we have a mental health crisis around the world. I'll be speaking from a US perspective and my US experience, but the same is true all over the world. We lack the tools at this point to really stem the tide of rising rates of depression, suicide, other mental health conditions, of course exacerbated by the recent pandemic. But I'm then optimistically going to focus on ketamine, which to this point is the only, at least in the US, federally legal to prescribe medication option that has psychedelic-like properties and has been shown to be more rapid acting, and to take the lessons from ketamine and carry those forward to think about new treatments that are coming down the pipeline, new psychedelic therapies, the new models of care that have been developed to deliver ketamine that can be lessons for and models for the new therapies coming, but also taking into account some of the considerations of cost and accessibility and the lessons we've learned there from Spravato, the US and EU approved and licensed form of ketamine. That has had a rocky commercial launch with a lot of challenges that also we could potentially learn from ahead of new therapies coming. Quick disclaimer, you can see at the bottom, this presentation reflects my own journey, my perspectives on this field from the standpoint of a medical model, treating psychiatric diagnoses, Certainly, there have been others using ketamine as a therapeutic tool to assist therapy for quite some time, and they might certainly tell the story in a different way. But I'll start with some numbers, and these are US-based numbers, although they hold for the rest of the world. Sadly, the next couple of slides, which focus on US populations, extend to world populations and reflect the fact that we've got a big problem. Depression in particular is the leading cause of disability worldwide. We spend more money treating mental health disorders than other leading conditions like heart conditions and cancer. And it's only getting worse. Again, these are US numbers, but we've seen a 33% increase in the diagnosis of depression in the US over the past decade, and that trend is only continuing upward. And this is in part due to the fact that there's really been very little innovation in the field of psychiatry in the past 70 years or so. Most of our tools are based upon the monoamine hypothesis of depression. The monoamines, of course, being serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, with agents like the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the tricyclic antidepressants, then the SSRIs and SNRIs, atypical antipsychotics, all tools that are focused on modulating monoamine levels. And fortunately, they have helped millions of people, but there's also millions of people that they don't help. And there are high rates of what we call treatment resistance, which is a troubling term because it suggests some blame lying with a patient, although the technical definition just reflects the fact that it's a failure of the treatment attempt itself, not a failure of the patient. But these are also tools that don't necessarily have great patient acceptance. They take too long to work, weeks to months, if they even will. The selection of one of these tools is essentially throwing a dart. And they have burdensome side effects that also lead to low adherence rates. Patients oftentimes stop these medicines or don't take them on a consistent basis because, number one, it's tough to take a medicine every single day. And number two, it's tough to take it when it's causing things like sexual side effects, weight gain, gastrointestinal distress. So highlights that we truly need new tools to bring to bear on this tremendous problem. So I mentioned this timeline starts in 2010. In 2010, I was in private practice, the private practice of psychiatry in Princeton, New Jersey, in the US, largely conducting psychotherapy, more so than prescribing medicines. But I did a second opinion consultation for someone who had tried just about everything under the sun, including electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, had not been able to benefit from any of these treatments. And in discussion with her, we discovered that the one thing that had ever seemed to help her mood was the coincidence of taking cough medicines when she was ill and noticing that her mood lifted. And the ingredient that was common in the different medicines she was taking was the cough suppressant dextromethorphan. That made me really, really curious. What is it about dextromethorphan that would explain her observation? And further from that, is there any research-based evidence that would support that observation and through what mechanism? And are there other medicines out there that seem to also work through that mechanism? And that turned up a handful of candidates, medicines like amantadine, which is often used as an antiviral for Parkinson's disease, memantine, the dementia drug, riluzole, which is used for ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I came across an interesting use of medicines with this mechanism. And so here we're talking about NMDA receptor antagonists, and saw that the first reports of antidepressant properties, observed antidepressant properties from an NMDA receptor antagonist were all the way back in 1959, reported by George Crane, treating patients with D-cycloserine for tuberculosis. and followed up with another paper in 1961. But of course, the medicine that really caught my interest and attention was ketamine. And so as this group, I'm sure well knows, ketamine is quite an old drug at this point. It was first synthesized in 1962 by Cal Stevens in Michigan as a contractor for Park Davis. He was creating a catalog of aerocyclohexylamines to be alternatives to phencyclidine as an anesthetic. It was US FDA approved in 1970 as an anesthetic. Fairly quickly developed some recognition in the underground psychedelic world for having some mental health applications. Also fairly quickly developed a troubled reputation as both a club drug and as a horse tranquilizer, which of course are the headlines that we always see in the media. Unfortunately, we never see World Health Organization, essential medicine, anesthetic with unique safety profile. We see horse tranquilizer and club drug, but so it is. I'm obviously glossing over large portions of the early history of ketamine here, and so I point you to two excellent books that give a very thorough overview and history of ketamine and its early uses. Carl Jansen's Ketamine, Dreams and Realities, and the Ketamine Papers, a newer book that was edited by Phil Wolfson. Excuse me. But what really got me excited back in 2010 was starting to review with a close eye some of the early papers looking at the repurposing of ketamine in very low subanesthetic doses for depression and related psychiatric indications. And so starting with the seminal paper in 2000 in Biological Psychiatry, reporting this very unexpected finding of almost immediate and relatively sustained antidepressant effects to a single administration of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of OVID ketamine. Then the replication of that from the NIMH group in 2006 in a small study with 18 participants. Then in 2010, a small open label study in a small group of folks with bipolar depression as an add-on to either lithium or valproic acid. And then the first study of the repeated administration of intravenous ketamine, establishing the initial protocol that was been used by many others in many studies since then, essentially mimicking the pattern of administration of ECT, which is classically given 3 days per week. The initial protocol of a repeated administration of ketamine being given 3 times per week for 2 weeks for 6 administrations total. And in this study from the Mount Sinai group, demonstrating that with repeated administration within a relatively short frame of time, not only do they continue to show very rapid response, but also fairly durable response of about 18 days. And so, looking at these studies, again, we're in 2010, it made me ask the question, why wouldn't we think about using this, right? At least for people who have tried everything else under the sun and haven't benefited, are suffering with severe treatment-resistant depression, are at high risk for suicide. Why wouldn't we think about using this? And so I started a program with a local hospital, quickly moved it out of there into a freestanding center when I started to learn some hard lessons through experience of the importance of set and setting, and a chaotic hospital setting not being an ideal setting to deliver a medicine like ketamine. But initially was treating patients within my own private practice. Then people started traveling from around the country, from around the world, because at this point, in terms of receiving ketamine outside of a clinical trial, there really weren't many options. Really felt gratified by doing this work, found it to be a tool that was very effective, but of course didn't help everyone. But also saw this as an opportunity to build an infrastructure that to that point hadn't existed in psychiatry. One that spans the psychiatric and medical worlds, and is appropriate not only to deliver a medicine like ketamine, but potentially some of the other interventional treatments that were in development at that point are now in later development and hopefully will be available to us soon. But another thing learned early on from ketamine was something about other targets for development of new antidepressants. Because like I mentioned earlier, up to this point, most of the targets of antidepressants have been the monoamine system. And the observed rapid-acting antidepressant and anti-suicidal properties of ketamine allow us to look at other models, including the synaptogenic hypothesis of depression. And an interesting one because, like ketamine itself, is more transdiagnostic, right? Not necessarily just a hypothesis that explains the genesis of depression and therapeutic targets, but also, perhaps for conditions that may be the common underpinnings for multiple diagnoses, which by their very nature are somewhat useful but artificial and may have more in common than just the symptoms that overlap in these Venn diagrams if we were to overlay them. And so, of course, the synaptogenic hypothesis explains that, number one, we can observe that with long-standing stress, generally, we can see the loss of the number, function, and quality of synaptic connections, particularly between important cognitive areas like the prefrontal cortex and target limbic regions like the hippocampus. Allows us to look at the brain and its function in more of a network way than just a target receptor way. And so, very quickly became a therapeutic pathway of great interest for those conducting research and development for new compounds. In the meantime, research continued from the Mount Sinai group, a replication of that repeated ketamine infusion study, again using that paradigm of 6 infusions within 2 weeks, 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV over 40 minutes, and with about an 18-day duration of effect on average following response. By the way, one kind of fun story that some of you may know, but some people wonder, where did 40 minutes come from in these initial studies? And it's important because there are some who put a lot of stock in the absolute dogma of 40 minutes of an infusion. But the truth is that where 40 minutes came from was in that 2000 study that was published in Biological Psychiatry. John Crystal, Dennis Charney, when they were designing that study, they calculated the time it would take for patients to complete the self-rated scales, which was about 30 minutes, and then they added 10 minutes as a fudge factor. So perhaps these things aren't as specific as we might think or might hope that they would be. In any case, in 2012 also, from the NIH group, there was a replication of the bipolar depression study. And then in terms of real-world evidence, by this point, so I'm now jumping ahead, I'm going to jump back and forth a bit, but jumping ahead to 2017, we presented some data from Actify Neurotherapies, my former practice. We presented data at the CIMP thematic meeting on treatment-resistant depression that was held in Prague. Up until this point in 2017, we did not collect data in the most efficient way. We were rating patients, both clinician-rated scales as well as patient self-rated scales at every treatment, good for us. The way that we were collecting it was tied to patients' electronic medical records, not in a searchable database. And so in order to actually analyze data, we had to go into each patient's chart visit by visit to look at outcomes. Bad for us. So that was very, very tedious work. So we did it for this poster for CIMP, although started treating patients with ketamine in 2011. This analysis looked at patients treated between 2014 and 2016. They were taken from the 7 locations that were in operation around the US at that point, the 7 Actify locations. And some interesting things to highlight from this poster. I know that you probably cannot read this on your screens. This will be quite an eye test. But some things that might be interesting to you from this poster. This was a longitudinal look at patient outcomes. 740 patients representing about 7,000 infusions. In this section, if you can see my cursor, the longest treated patient here was almost 4 years, but the average duration of treatment was about 12 months, with the average number of infusions received per patient a little over 9. We, as our protocol, tended to start with 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV over 40 minutes, but had some flexibility to make some increases in the dose as indicated clinically. But as you can see, not a ton of titration in this population. The average final dose for these patients was just over 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. One of the, I think, most interesting things to look at here is not just response rates, but the breakdown of these response rates. Because, so first of all, the outcome measure in this case, the one we used here, was the CGI. We had our clinicians fill out a CGI-I at every visit. And so that allows us to identify partial responders, responders, and full responders or remission. And up until this point, up until about 2014, we were not treating anybody who had not already tried at least tricyclics or MAOIs, and in most cases, ECT or TMS. And if we look at response rates for all patients versus patients who had previously not responded to TMS, those who hadn't previously responded to ECT, or those who hadn't responded previously to ECT and TMS, the response rates were actually pretty comparable. And in general, if we included full and partial responders, around 75%. If we're looking just at response, then that, excuse me, was about 55 to 60%. And partial response, non-responders then, about a quarter of patients. In the meantime, I was part of a study in 2017 with the Yale group that did a survey of the growing use of ketamine in clinical practice around the US, because at this point, the word was getting out, patients were starting to demand this, and practitioners were starting to sprout up to meet the need. And as you can see, and again, this is just US, over the course of 2007 through 2010, 2011, 12, 13, 14, really, quite few places in the US where you could receive ketamine treatment. All of a sudden in 2015, and certainly in 2016, and now going almost vertically up from there in 2017 and beyond, this number jumped tremendously. And this survey didn't even capture everyone, right? These were people we were able to identify because they had websites that advertised the fact that they were offering this treatment, or it was otherwise obvious that they were, but certainly missed others. At this point in 2021, I'm only slightly kidding when I say that in the US, everyone and their uncle has a ketamine clinic. Excuse me. In terms of where I was delivering treatment with Actify, which sadly closed about a year ago, mostly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's represented by the dark blue states, so concentrated on the East Coast, but also Colorado and California. Since have helped to co-found a new company that will, in part, deliver ketamine amongst other therapies based in Texas. In the meantime, in the face of this widespread proliferation of quote unquote ketamine clinics, There's been a lot of questions about what is the optimal dose, what is the optimal duration, what's the optimal route of administration. If somebody is a responder to ketamine, but perhaps doesn't have a durable response or needs to continue with another therapy that's not ketamine, what do you do? There have been a tremendous amount of unanswered questions that's led to the Wild West of quite varied practices, some more evidence-based than others. Here was a study by Colleen Liu's group looking at a comparison of IV to intramuscular or sub-Q routes of administration. Something that's become more and more common in the US is the prescription of formulations of ketamine to be taken at home, including oral, sublingual, lozenges, troches, etc. A practice that I have some feelings about and I think come with a lot of risks. Also, and Sergio and I were discussing this just before we started this today, almost every study that we can find looks at this prototypical paradigm of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV. There really has been little exploration of the dose range and what might be optimal. The original choice of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram was largely because it's the dissociative threshold for the average person. And the hypothesis being that that dissociative threshold is a marker of target engagement, right? It's a marker that you have adequate binding at the NMDA receptor in order to elicit the antidepressant response. Here's an example of a study that actually did look at a range of doses, comparing 0.1 milligrams per kilogram to 0.2, 0.5, and 1.0. Also against an active comparator of midazolam. Interestingly, although that initial 0.5 was just a guess, far and away the strongest signal in the study was at that 0.5 dose, with also strong response at the 1.0 dose. There was a positive signal at 0.1, a weak one, but not at 0.2, suggesting that that 0.1 may have been a red herring. But this is important because certainly preclinical data suggests that there may be a U-shaped response curve to ketamine, such that too low of a dose may not have antidepressant properties, but also too high of a dose may not have antidepressant properties. In an attempt to try to wrangle some of these very disparate practices that, again, some of which are more evidence-based than others, I had the honor of attending a very interesting conference at the Banbury Center at Cold Spring Harbor Labs in 2015. 25 of us spent 3 days. This was primarily some of the lead researchers in the ketamine space, including people from NIMH like Carlos Zarate, the Yale and Mount Sinai groups. Other stakeholders involved were touched by ketamine in some way. And this yielded a paper which was published in JAMA Psychiatry, which was a consensus statement acknowledging the use in the community at this point and making some loose recommendations for safe practice, stopping short of writing guidelines. Excuse me. Like I mentioned before, another area of interest is what might help sustain the durability of ketamine. So first of all, it is pretty remarkable that the half-life of IV ketamine is only 2.5 hours, yet it can yield an antidepressant response for days to maybe weeks, right? In effect, well beyond its blood level, which of course is quite different than something like the SSRIs. Nonetheless, not durable enough, right? We have some very promising but early studies on psychedelics at this point that suggest that single administrations may have much more durable responses. In the case of ketamine, and I meant to highlight this before actually on that poster, the response can be fairly durable. In this cohort of patients, the average interval between maintenance infusions was just over 4 weeks, so about a month of durability. Nonetheless, That's not necessarily, oh, I'm going in the wrong direction here. That's not necessarily very practical when we're thinking about intravenous infusions of ketamine and the cost and burden on patients to continually come back for IV infusions. And so some of the things investigated have been cognitive behavioral therapy. This was a small pilot study at Yale that did show that cognitive behavioral therapy following ketamine may help sustain the benefit. A mechanism that's very interesting to me, so here's another little anecdote. When I first started treating patients with ketamine in 2011, in addition to the fact that I would only treat people who had no other options, I also initially arbitrarily capped the total duration of treatment at 6 months, for the reason just that we didn't have any long-term safety data in this population. That meant that for anybody who was responding, I had at most 6 months to try to find something that could help sustain the response in an oral form that wasn't ketamine. And of course, these are people who hadn't benefited from tricyclics and MAOIs and everything else under the sun. And so invariably what happened after, the things you might think of like amantadine or memantine or scopolamine or riluzole weren't effective enough, at least for not enough people, had some very difficult conversations with patients who would look me in the eye and say, so Steve, we're 4 or 5 months in here, and I know you said I can't continue this after 6 months. I'm doing great. I'm having a maintenance infusion once a month. I feel fine. I'm not having any side effects. You're telling me I'm going to have to stop this next month? And we know what's going to happen, right? So pretty quickly, I needed to abandon that 6-month cap. But I was nonetheless still very interested in how we might be able to extend the durability of response. One of the strategies that I found most effective over time, and bringing my story full circle to that patient who was taking cough medicine in 2010, was combinations with dextromethorphan, medicines that can inhibit its metabolism by blocking the 2D6 inhibitor, or being 2D6 inhibitors, excuse me, and that being combinations like dextromethorphan quinidine, as found in commercial Nuedexta, or a drug in development right now, which recently filed for FDA approval, AXS-05, a combination of dextromethorphan and bupropion. So, some promising compounds that essentially mimic ketamine's mechanism, but without causing dissociative effects, and now having some evidence to demonstrate that they indeed, have antidepressant properties in their own right. And so certainly for those who demonstrate response to ketamine's mechanism, an interesting option. In the meantime, also, research on ketamine has expanded beyond unipolar major depression and bipolar depression. Ketamine may act transdiagnostically, or as Carlos Arate says, maybe somewhat pan-therapeutic. So there's been promising small trials in PTSD for obsessive compulsive disorder, looking at other populations like adolescents and older adults. So other promising areas of research. We had the opportunity back in 2018 as the larger psychiatric community and the medical community as a whole were starting to recognize the increasing prevalence of the use of ketamine in this off-label way for psychiatric indications. We were asked to guest edit an issue of Psychiatric Annals. And so we covered topics like the pharmacologic profile of ketamine, its use in mood disorders, its use in comorbid pain, depression, and substance use disorders, excuse me, and then the implications of glutamatergic agents for PTSD, OCD, and other applications. Also in 2017, we saw the first professional societies sprout up around the use of ketamine. I was a co-founder of the American Society of Ketamine, originally Ketamine Physicians, since it's been rebranded, as the American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners. This is 400 plus providers around the US and beyond who are delivering ketamine therapeutically at this point. Of particular interest right now is that the ASKP is sponsoring a certification program. It's being administered by a third party, and this will be a licensing or certification exam, I should say, that helps establish a basic knowledge base and skill set in order to deliver therapy. And it's anticipated that the first sitting for this exam will be in the fall of 2021. In the meantime, there's this concept of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy that's not new. People like Phil Wolfson and his partner Julian Andrews have been practicing ketamine-assisted therapy for a number of years. It seems that really in the past year or so, especially since so many of us in the US and probably beyond have been pollinated by Michael Pollan's book, and it seems like over the past year, there's been increasing awareness and attention around new psychedelic therapies. There's been a lot of talk of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and many of those folks who created ketamine clinics around the US are starting to advertise that they deliver ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. The paper here is very helpful because it actually describes what they're doing. I would say in general, I'm a bit confused by ketamine-assisted psychotherapy just because I don't know what it really means, because I think that it's delivered in very, very different ways around the country and around the world, but using the same term. And there really have not been any papers, any evidence to not only describe a standard of the therapy, but demonstrate what role it plays in the efficacy of using ketamine, at least for psychiatric indications and diagnoses. So perhaps important to distinguish that for the use of ketamine for those without a diagnosed psychiatric disorder who might be approaching this perhaps in a more transpersonal way or for personal growth. But I think one thing that is an opportunity for the field is to arrive at a more consistent definition and a research tested definition of what we mean when we say ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and to understand who this is for and by what method and in what setting, and all the other details that follow. And I should mention actually along those lines, although especially in my former life with Actify, we were delivering ketamine intravenously almost exclusively, also sometimes intramuscularly, through this NIMH paradigm of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram over 40 minutes, titrating up to typically a ceiling of 1 milligram per kilogram or so. And we didn't necessarily call what we were doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. We didn't use words like preparation or integration. It actually, if you look at the activities being performed, is what we were doing in a sense. Certainly we were conducting extensive preparation prior to dosing sessions, having therapeutic support available during dosing. And then, although we weren't really calling a lot of attention to the psychedelic aspect of ketamine in the discussion of it, because our attempt was to deliver this within a medical model and to not turn off those who were not comfortable, if you will, with the idea of psychedelics. The message we attempted to deliver to patients after their session was, you've just been on a journey, we want to hear all about it. In a very open-ended way, exploring patients' experiences and seeing how they might be able to carry forward any insights generated during the ketamine session into their life beyond treatment. And so I think one of the things that's changing more and more, at least right now in the US, is not necessarily the method of practice so much as the language that we're using to talk about it, given the increasing awareness and comfort around psychedelic therapies. One other thing to point out, this is a joke that's often made. You can see here a few review studies piled on top of each other. It's often said that there have been more review papers on ketamine than there have been actual studies. And so that's important for us to keep in mind too. Although there's a ton of papers out there, many of them are just talking about the research. They're not actual research. And ultimately, these are relatively small numbers of patients in relatively uncontrolled studies that are looking at a pretty narrow spectrum of how ketamine might be delivered. But one to call out is one that was published just recently, and along the lines of trying to create some standards in this increasingly fragmented landscape of how people are delivering treatment without necessarily evidence to support it. The paper at the bottom was recently published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, in an attempt to synthesize the currently available evidence around ketamine and esketamine, as well as some opinions on implementation. Some further real-world evidence. I recently had the opportunity to present the entire Actify data set of over 6,000 patients and over 60,000 infusions given at the virtual CINP World Conference, 2021 World Conference. We used a different outcome measure for this analysis. We looked at patient status from their own self-report using the QIDS SR16 and the GAD-7 at the time of their first maintenance infusion. A limitation of this study was that the timing of them completing the QIDS and the GAD-7 scales was that they were filling these out on tablets in the waiting room just prior to the maintenance infusion. And in most cases, patients were coming in for a maintenance treatment because they were starting to have some return of symptoms. So in a way, we were catching patients at their worst, likely at the nadir of their mood and the peak of anxiety, but nonetheless showing meaningful response. I'm getting close to the end here, but I think another important subject as we now move up to today and looking forward, there was an interesting paper that got a lot of attention back in 2017, or maybe it's 2018, from the group at University of Maryland, led by Todd Gould. This was in a mouse model, but it was suggestive that ketamine was not actually acting through the NMDA receptor or NMDA receptor antagonism to exert its antidepressant effects, but rather it was a prodrug and metabolized to the active compound 2R6R hydroxynorketamine acting through AMPA throughput. And this was interesting timing because Johnson & Johnson, or Janssen, was getting close to the end of their Spravato program for esketamine, and this paper seemed to suggest that R-ketamine might be the enantiomer of interest. And so, there is some ongoing debate there about racemic ketamine versus S versus R versus hydroxynorketamine. I don't think that story is fully written yet, but it's a good segue into talking about Spravato, because Spravato is a very interesting case study when we're talking about the lessons from ketamine as well as the promise of coming psychedelics. Spravato, of course, is esketamine, a nasal delivery. It was FDA and EU approved in 2019, but to this point, it's largely been a commercial failure. It's been rejected by most European HTA bodies. It is covered by payers in the US, but highly restricted. And I think largely because of issues of cost reimbursement and the fact that the necessary infrastructure to deliver a therapy like this really isn't built yet, right? So there's controversy around Spravato in the quote unquote ketamine community because a position might be, why do we need an expensive brand name medicine when we have cheap generic ketamine that's plentiful? But part of the response to that is it's still a big deal, because if we are truly interested in creating access for as many people as possible who need these new treatments, for it to be accessible means it needs to be affordable. And for most people, only affordable if it is directly FDA approved and therefore insurance or payer covered, and therefore the burden of the cost not falling to the patient. And so in the US, the average cost for a ketamine treatment for a patient would be several $100s per treatment. But the cost for Spravato is often a $10 copay. Nonetheless, because of the cost to providers in terms of staffing, what is involved in participating in the REMS program, which is mandated, the risk evaluation mitigation strategy, the costs and burdens associated with ordering and prescribing Spravato, et cetera. We really have not seen Spravato getting to many patients. And so now when we think about the psychedelics coming, these are extraordinarily exciting and promising compounds and molecules. And as I think probably most of us are aware here, there are many, many companies right now working on a variety of programs for a variety of indications for several psychedelics. But of great importance here is that they all are fairly resource intensive to deliver them. They require specialized settings, they require therapists, they require prescribers, they require individual rooms for many hours. It's an infrastructure that largely doesn't exist to this point. It mostly exists in what's built already to deliver ketamine or maybe Spravato. There are not, at least in the US, there are not codes that exist at this point that describe these therapies and therefore lead to a path to reimbursement from payers. And so, some tremendous challenges lie ahead as we think about this concept of, big unmet need, a lot of excitement, at least from small trials at this point. We need larger studies and more data, but so far things look promising. But how is this actually going to get to the people that need it? And so in conclusion, and hopefully leaving a good amount of time for some questions here, ketamine represents a unique case of a psychiatric treatment approach progressing from the lab to the clinic outside of the usual regulatory pathway. There really are very few other examples of that. Off-label or off-license prescribing is not uncommon, but this is a whole other story. The development of a licensed form of ketamine has demonstrated the economic and infrastructure barriers to widespread adoption and access. And the psychedelics in the pipeline are going to face similar challenges, but we have the opportunity to learn a lot from ketamine in the meantime. So thank you all for your attention, and now look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for this very, very interesting talk. A lot of fascinating facts about and around ketamine. We have actually a couple of questions here. Let's start with the one about insurance coverage. What is the insurance coverage for ketamine therapy like currently? Could that be a mediating factor of why patients are returning only after 4 weeks or more?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, right now, in most cases in the US, there is not direct insurance coverage for ketamine for any psychiatric indication. There are a few exceptions. There are, in Northern California, payer Kaiser Permanente has a small program. In Massachusetts and in Connecticut, there's a couple of payers who have ketamine policies, but they're the exception more than the rule. There's currently a large pilot study happening looking at ketamine head-to-head with Spravato, and the results of that might influence some large payers to write direct coverage policies. So that remains to be seen. But in the meantime, your point is spot on, right? Why is that average interval 4 weeks? In part, that may be because of the burden of cost. And if cost was no factor, was no issue, then perhaps patients might come back more frequently and might benefit from coming back more frequently. Of course, with the trade-off of the burden of needing to come into a center for treatment frequently.
Thank you. A question that I have would be, you talked about applying the language that you've been always using this kind of approach of also providing treatment and not only ketamine as a medication. Are you now changing the language of how you frame your therapy, or are you just keeping it as it was before?
Many are, for me and with Heading Health, not aggressively, and it's very intentional, right? It's not because I don't recognize the power of language or value these particular terms. It's because the biggest priority for me is access, right? I want as many people who could potentially benefit from treatment that need it to have access as possible. And for those familiar with the US landscape, it's not one country, right? It's at least two, probably more. There are those on the coasts in places like San Francisco or in New York who are using language like this every day. It's what they expect, it's what they're comfortable with. But there are lots and lots of people in other parts of the country who are not as comfortable with the notions of psychedelics, who are not, who would be, very much turned away or turned off if what was really emphasized was the psychedelic component. And so that's, to me, is very different than not valuing that experience and actually using that as part of the mechanism of ketamine and the benefit that people get, so much as being careful about the language so that people don't resist treatment or not consider treatment merely because of it. Yeah. So we do all the same stuff. It's just how we talk about it.
Right. Here's another question. What's in Spravato? Just esketamine and water?
Yeah, it's esketamine and the stuff that helps it to stick to the nasal mucosa and get through it.
Well, it's a patented compound, and the way of delivering and all of that. So it's maybe there's something else there that made it patentable.
Yeah, I think there's some other inactive ingredients too, but it's the business end of it is esketamine.
How effective is nasal spray compared to IV or IM ketamine?
That's an interesting question and a good one. There are many different routes of administration for ketamine. Intravenous, intramuscular, subcutaneous, intranasal, oral, sublingual, rectal, transcutaneous. I mean, there are many. The key differences amongst them are the bioavailability, as well as the kinetics. And in some cases, ratios of metabolites, which may or may not be important. In the case of nasal, one of the interesting things is that even prior to the launch of Spravato, people were getting nasal ketamine in the US, just largely through compounding pharmacies. We have many, pharmacies in the US that can take the stock ingredients and kind of custom make medications. The generic forms of the racemic ketamine given nasally were always kind of limiting, just because the maximum concentration that ketamine comes in is 100 milligrams per kilogram, and it's a thin liquid. And the typical nasal inhalers aren't necessarily an optimized delivery device. And so you wind up having to use lots and lots of sprays. You saturate the mucosa quickly, it drips, it's a mess, it drips down the throat, it tastes terrible. So there was, some innovation on the part of Janssen to to use a somewhat more concentrated form with S-ketamine and a stickier formulation, and one that shoots it further up and back into the nasal passages for better absorption. And so, there's a good chance that may be more effective just because it's a more reliable delivery than the racemic forms. But in terms of comparing IV ketamine, let's say, versus IM ketamine versus S-ketamine, hard to say. There aren't many head-to-head studies there. Most of them are probably pretty comparable. There was a recent small study looking at racemic ketamine versus nasal S-ketamine in a non-inferiority design. It was not inferior mostly, although there's lots of asterisks around that. I don't think we really have the answers yet. So it's a good question.
Thank you. I was very surprised about the dextromethorphan part of the treatment. It's a very innovative and way of going about it. There's also a paper about nitrous oxide as an NMDA receptor antagonist. Have you had any experience with that?
I haven't. It's another one of those agents that the small studies have kind of run in parallel with ketamine and some of these other newer agents of interest. They're very compelling, small, early studies. It's something that I thought about over time, ultimately decided not to deliver. As a psychiatrist in a psychiatry practice, I thought it was probably not the most appropriate thing in our offices for safety reasons. Certainly interesting. And it's not also the only inhaled anesthetic that may have antidepressant properties either, right? There's studies on, I think, sevoflurane and isoflurane. Many of these may be promising as well.
Well, whereas sevoflurane and isoflurane have a very different mechanism of action. If you take a look at the last 30, 40 years of publications, they didn't have a real explanation on how this anesthetic state comes to be until 2020, where they showed something as a lipid membrane fluidity and so on. So yeah. Another question about ketamine and addiction. Do you have had any patient getting addicted to ketamine? Do you have any patients that take ketamine at home?
So, though we take it very seriously, we haven't seen a lot of difficulties with that. Now, in part, that may be because, number one, we're screening patients pretty carefully. And although there's also very exciting literature on the use of ketamine for substance use disorders, we've not been treating substance use disorders. We've been treating primarily mood and anxiety disorders. And so we've also been screening for patients with active substance use disorders or folks not in recovery. And also, we never prescribe for people to take home. And so there's the access issue, right? And people would have to be sourcing ketamine on their own on the street, but not from ketamine supplied in our offices. And there's some strong opinions on all sides of that, the take-home ketamine issue. To me, just from a regulatory standpoint, given that Spravato was embedded within this REMS program that dictates that it must be followed by 2 hours of observation, would say that if there's a bad outcome, and of course there will be at some point, law of numbers, large numbers, that this would be challenged by state medical boards and somebody wouldn't have a leg to stand on. And so again, for those reasons, it probably influences why I haven't seen many difficulties with misuse or the development of addiction. But no, it's something that we haven't seen a big problem with, and likely because of the intention, the setting, the doses used, the frequency, all of which make it less likely that somebody would develop tolerance, escalate the dose, etc.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here about any recommended add-on medicines for ketamine treatment or severe treatment-resistant depression. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that I've spent a lot of time on over the years, and it's been interesting. I spoke a little bit before about the dextromethorphan-based medicines, and I don't have to do as much hand waving these days because AXS-05 is about to be FDA approved and probably approved in the EU too, and Nudexa is a real thing, even though it's not for an indication of depression, but it's otherwise FDA approved, and there have been some studies in depression at this point. Back in 2012, 2013, when I was talking about these things with patients, I had to do a whole lot of explaining. But outside of those, some other medicines that have at least anecdotally seemed to potentially have synergistic effects with ketamine or augment or extend its benefit have been things like lithium. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the mechanistic explanation for that is GSK3 beta inhibition, which may be one of the required initial steps in ketamine's mechanism. That came from actually a couple of early patients of mine who had a wonderful response to ketamine, were having infrequent maintenance treatments, and all of a sudden weren't responding anymore. And for different reasons, and unbeknownst to me ahead of time, had stopped lithium. They had been taking lithium and stopped it. And when we figured that out and they restarted lithium, then they responded beautifully again. And so, kind of carried that learning forward and looked at that a bit over time. Scopolamine has appeared to have some synergistic benefit along with ketamine, somewhat different initial mechanism as an anticholinergic, but maybe meeting up at the mTOR pathway. But anecdotally, that seemed to be an effective strategy, especially for some of our patients with OCD who had overall much lower response to ketamine. But when we would add in a scopolamine patch, some of them had a much stronger response.
And you would add it on the therapy session, or
we would have them put it on the night before an infusion, and then leave it on for as long as they could up to their tolerability, up to 72 hours post.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Some people didn't want to leave it on because they got hot and flushed and thirsty. And
it's not a nice. Yeah. So there's this one small study about blocking with naloxone the opioid receptors, and ketamine ceases to work. What's your take on that one?
Highly skeptical of that. We've although I've said that we don't treat patients with primary substance use disorders, we've had a lot of patients in recovery over time who are on maintenance naltrexone or naloxone in some form. Or those who have had it as part of a combination pill for weight loss. There's a combination pill with naltrexone for weight loss. Patients on a depot medicine, and they. I'm getting a message. My connection's unstable. Hopefully you can hear me. They seem to respond at the same rate as everybody else. And so, highly, highly skeptical of that. Certainly highly skeptical of the idea that study proved that the antidepressant effects are modulated through the opioid receptor, which is pretty absurd, actually.
I absolutely agree with you. I've read that study, and for me, it's too small. It would be too simple. This explanation that they offer, it's way too simple for.
I like to quote Jason Wallach on that. For those of you who know Jason Wallach, who is probably one of the world's experts on aerocyclohexylamines and synthetic chemistry and with psychedelics, he addressed that in a talk at one point and said that, yes, ketamine does bind to the opioid receptor, but to get it to actually act like an opiate, you'd have to give enough ketamine to kill someone, and it's really hard to kill someone with ketamine.
Yeah, it's a very safe drug. Yeah. Maybe. What are your thoughts about the this psychedelic renaissance? This things that seem to come into the field, like psilocybin or other psychoactive compounds. Are they going to push ketamine and the ketamine treatment out of the way are going to take their place, or how do you see the future?
Yeah, my guess is that the new psychedelic therapies will exist side by side with ketamine. We need as many tools as possible. And, sadly, no one of these compounds realistically is going to help everyone. And by their very nature, the conditions we are treating with these compounds are relapsing and remitting. And there's a whole lot of people out there that need help. And so I think the more tools that we have, the better off we'll be, the better prepared we'll be. And likely over time, there will be some distinguishing factors that'll help us with the differential therapeutics of selecting which tool is most appropriate for someone.
Sure.
But I don't think ketamine's going anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. Here's another question about IV, IM, nasal, or lozenges. Do you have any experience with the different application forms that you could say one is better than the other, and why?
Sure. And this certainly is just my opinion, right? And I think lots and lots of people would have very, very different opinions. But for me, as somebody who is primarily interested in treating people in a supervised medical setting, not sending people home with ketamine in some form, then most of my experience is with IV and IM. And I think of them as fairly comparable. Right? Certainly, we have a bit more control with IV. We can titrate up, down, extend infusion time, shorten it, etc. IM is sort of just a dumb administration. Stick and there it is. Not much you can do about it at that point. But but in terms of absorption, in terms of what is clinically significant, pretty similar, right? And so you can do similar things with it. Nasal, I have, some experience with a few patients with prescribing it in that racemic form through the inhaler, and it had the limitations that I described before, just with the saturation of the mucosa, the dripping, absorption difficulties. It seemed to not really help people very well. With lozenges, certainly I could see the advantage of using those if you're sending somebody home with ketamine. I believe they're also used by some people in group administrations, even in a supervised setting. But I don't have experience with that, so I can't speak to it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the lozenges are very much a thing treating chronic pain for taking it home. So that would be the field where you find that, and that makes it also interesting to see the comorbidity of depression and chronic pain, which is also something that goes hand in hand. So one last question before we let you go. I will just read it out. I wonder if you could tell us about the important lessons you learned about set and setting while using ketamine in a busy hospital setting. Are there any essential rules to follow? Some Scottish hospitals could begin using esketamine for treatment-resistant depression by the end of this year.
Yeah, first of all, there's certainly a long-standing active example of patients being treated in the opposite of what we would think of optimal set and setting, which is at Yale University, where they've been treating patients with IV ketamine and now Spravato for a long time. They treat a ton of patients, and they do it in their ECT suite. So they don't have private rooms. It's people on gurneys in bays that are divided by curtains, in a post-anesthesia care unit where you couldn't imagine a more chaotic setting. And the outcomes for their patients look like everywhere else. So that's something that goes against set and setting. However, where would you want to have treatment, and what would you want those conditions to be like? When I started delivering it in a hospital, and it was loud, and it was with a staff that wasn't used to delivering medicines like this, and my first patients, and not really knowing what to expect, given that the only information I had was reading a few papers that didn't even talk very much about the experience. I quickly realized that because of the dissociative nature of ketamine, there is really a heightening of perception that patients have in terms of the acuity of their hearing and their sensitivity to all kinds of stimuli in the environment. And so what was mildly annoying to me was cacophonous for them. Mm-hmm. And then I was somewhat anxious about treating people with this medicine. And so I was very active, right? I was, 3 inches from their face, just constantly asking if they were okay and what's going on and are they all right? And I was so annoying. And so I realized that I needed to relax because they were fine. We needed to minimize stimuli, including the intervention of the therapist, at least, in the most dissociative portions of this experience, to really follow the patient's lead. And if they were internally focused on their experience and learning from that, then I shouldn't interfere with that. But at the same time, be available to support them should they need it. And also quickly learn that music tends to guide this experience, but that people have widely different opinions about what is the right type of music to listen to. I initially assumed that what might be a better fit would be something that was mostly instrumental, not lots of lyrics, or spa-like music, or Tibetan singing bowls, or the stereotypical things you might think of. But from day one, I had patients who wanted to listen to heavy metal and dubstep and house and all kinds of stuff. And I jokingly tell the story, but this is true, that one of my early patients tried different genres of music with each treatment. And at the end, his report was, the only thing that was not good was Pink Floyd's The Wall. And I thought, okay, that makes sense, right? That's probably just a little too much. It's gilding the lily. And then a couple of years later, I sat down with a patient after he finished his treatment, and he said to me, so I was listening to The Wall during this, and it was the perfect thing. Right? So I very much got out of the music recommending business. I think it can be very individual, although there may also be a lot to learn from some studies, I think, that are starting that are looking more intentionally at the effect of music on this experience. And maybe we will find that something is better than something else. But in terms of preference, it's all over the map. So yeah, again, I guess in summary, I think I'd have to agree that there are some very important elements of set and setting. I don't think that we fully understand the implications of them, and that it's also possible to still do a lot of good for people, even under non-optimal conditions.
Mm-hmm. Steve, it has been a pleasure having you tonight here. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this fascinating presentation. And well, I hope we can see you at some point here in Berlin, live and in person.
I hope so. Enough of this virtual stuff. It's been a pleasure today, but let's get back to being face-to-face.
Exactly. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Sergio. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Steve. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful night. Bye-bye.